Hello everyone, Ethermode here. I would like to welcome you to the first video in a series where we are going to be breaking down Final Fantasy XIV Online and examining some of the core mechanics that the game does not quite tell you about. This video series is meant to assist new players in finding their way through the world with as little hassle as possible, as well as giving a reminder to returning and even current players on some things that are considered common knowledge amongst the community. In this particular video, we're going to be discussing the various methods in which enemies of the land plan to impede your progress, specifically in the form of area of effect attacks, here referred to as AoEs for the sake of simplicity. We're going to go over the most common forms of these AoEs, how to identify them, what they do, and most common ways to handle them with the hopes that you can take this knowledge and put it to good use in your time playing Final Fantasy XIV. Without further ado, let us begin. No matter where you find yourself, be it in the sprawling fields of Eorzea, the enchanting lands of Authard to the far east, or even in the mysterious woods of Navrant on the first, you will find enemies that seek to harm you. Between the base damage they deal with auto attacks as well as some unique skills to each type of enemy, more often than not if they live long enough they'll begin charging up a skill that will deal either a large amount of damage to an unprepared player or give a harrowing status effect, more commonly referred to as debuffs. It will make the rest of the fight that much harder. These skills are usually accompanied by what the online community has come to call telegraphs, or these large markers displayed on the ground or around a player that indicates where their attack will land. It is then your job as the player in control to move your character out of these in order to avoid taking the damage or suffer the debuff intended. There are several ways to handle these, and we will be addressing them in time and in no particular order. But to begin with, let us examine the most used overworld AoEs, those being telegraphs in the form of cones, circles, and lines. These are by far the most common and easiest to avoid AoEs as they have a rather generous cast time in order to give you ample opportunity to react. While they are generally considered to be the easiest to handle, they do come in all shapes, sizes, and varying degrees of occurrence, so it's best not to take them lightly. The best way to handle these types of AoEs is simply to move out of them. The timing required to perform such evasions is most times rather generous, requiring the character's hitbox to be out of the telegraph before the cast time of the skill ends. After the cast bar finishes, the game then takes a snapshot of where your character is in relation to the telegraph's edges, and then determines whether or not you'll be taking the damage. Moving away from your standard run-of-the-mill enemies, and focusing now on special monsters based around multi-character fights such as boss fates, dungeon bosses, trials, and even raid bosses. Here we have more character-centric mechanics that require positional awareness in order to mitigate the amount of damage that the party is taking. The most notable of these are the stack markers, notated by this large, normally golden-colored circular ring with large arrows placed on the outer ring pointing to a centralized point within the indicator itself. The purpose of those arrows is, in fact, telling of the way to handle this type of marker. Contrary to popular belief, in this case you actually want to be in the AoE. The damage taken by the primary target is then split between however many other characters there are within the zone of this particular AoE. The characters then designated to take this damage is calculated by the system at the end of the AoE's cast time, and then divided evenly between however many characters there were. Aside from your generic stack markers, it would also be remiss of me to neglect to mention a worthy exception. It does not technically count as an AoE, nor does it fit into our next category of targeted AoEs that we will discuss shortly, but this particular marker is represented by this red-colored, downward-facing triangle shape, with a small circle appearing under your character's feet. This particular attack can have a wide variety of effects, including, but not limited to, high damage followed by knocking your character up into the air, leaving you vulnerable for the following mechanics, or in the case of the footage that you're watching, turning you into a toad, preventing you from taking further actions until the effects wear off. This attack is negated entirely by simply standing with another party member that shares this type of marker until the cast time is over. As a note, if you ever encounter somebody referring to this mechanic as stacking the Doritos, this is the type of attack to which they're referring. As previously mentioned, the next on our list is a cult favorite of raid bosses as well as trial fights, and that is the targeted AoEs. These come in a variety of different forms, but their essence remains the same. It is, in its base form, an effect that targets one or more party members individually and then produces an AoE either at their location, in between the target and the boss in the form of an attack that is referred to here on as Earthshakers, or around the target forming a donut-shaped AoE with a safe spot in the middle. All of these have their own way to avoid excess damage to the party and follow the same formula. The AoE marker is produced, it follows the character wherever they move to, then once the prep phase for the cast is finished, the effect takes place. We will go into each form of these AoEs and break down their core mechanics a bit more in depth. For the AoEs that produce a circular telegraph beneath your character's feet that follows you around, unfortunately as it is, you are going to take the damage no matter what. That being said, when targeted with this type of attack, you have a responsibility to ensure that only you are hit by this damage. In the event that several people get the same type of AoE, it is okay to overlap them, so long as the edges of your AoE do not touch another player's character model. Should that happen, both you and that character would take damage, and in the likely event that both of you have one of these markers, more often than not that unfortunately means a character death for both of you. So it's best to stay safe and try and avoid overlapping as much as possible. Now, for the aforementioned Earthshakers, the way to deal with these is a tad bit tricky. When the AoE is placed over your head, it appears as a sort of golden arrow pointing down towards your character's head, with a silvery beam tracing into the sky. After you have been marked with this AoE, you have a few moments to determine where you're going. More often than not, at least one other person will also be marked with a similar indicator. At that point, the both of your responsibility is to separate yourselves from the rest of the party, generally off to the side of whatever arena you find yourselves in. Once the AoE resolves, there will be a line of damage that spans from the center of the boss's hitbox, through your character, all the way to the back of the arena in a straight line. Anybody else caught in between you and the boss, and anybody standing directly behind you will take the exact same amount of damage as you will, so that's why it's best to separate yourselves ways so that you find yourselves more isolated, thus reducing the amount of damage taken by the rest of the party, and making sure your healers have less of a hard time healing up afterwards. Lastly, we have the easiest to manage of the three, the donut-shaped AoE. When this marker begins its cycle, there will be an orb-shaped marker above the target's head, and surrounding them there will be a relatively wide ring. The safe spots for this attack is on either side of the ring, inside or out. The difficult part about this type of AoE is the primary target of the marker is responsible for where the ring goes. Generally speaking, if the primary target just stands still, everybody finds their way to a safe spot, and then nobody would take any damage. Now, of course, that won't always happen, that would just be the best case scenario. Otherwise, it's easiest just to follow your target, find yourself to a safe spot, and then continue DPSing the boss. Moving right along, we find ourselves with a relatively frequently used mechanic in dungeon boss fights, as well as other raids and trials, and that is the scary-looking eye marker. This attack, while rather ambiguous in its meaning, is often followed by a rather severe debuff that makes following other mechanics much more difficult. That being said, as ambiguous as it seems, dealing with this marker is rather trivial. All you need to do in order to avoid this effect is to turn your character model so that they are facing away from the target. Once you do that, a symbol will pop up next to your character saying that you dodged the effect, and you're free to go back to looking however way you like. Continuing on now to the second to last topic that I have for you all today, we find ourselves discussing the proximity markers. These rather ominous indicators are depicted by a sizable orange ringed circle and an accompanying pulsating animation expanding from the center. The purpose of this animation is telling of the way to handle it, in so fact of the further you are away from the center point of this AoE, the less damage you will take upon impact. Case in point, you see here while I am closer to the marker, I take significantly increased amount of damage than my ally across the way. At the time of recording this, we performed the dungeon without leveling down to meet the requirements and are thusly too healthy to depict what would really happen if you were this close, but trust me when I say you would much rather be over there with him than here with me. And of course, last but certainly not least, we come to our final AoE indicator. This one is commonly referred to by the community as towers. This type of AoE is indicated by a relatively wide circle marker and a silver pillar, coursing with orange and red energy protruding from the center of said circle. Should these markers not be dealt with properly, a large amount of damage is dealt to the whole party, as well as more often than not, an accompanying debuff that makes the next portions of the fight much more difficult. The way to deal with these is to have at least one member of the party standing in each of the pillars. Of course, you're welcome to have more than one person per pillar, but more people standing in them does not decrease the amount of damage taken by the party. That will about do it for this one. Thank you everybody so much for watching. If you like what you see here, I ask that you consider subscribing and following me on Twitch. I stream fairly frequently both Final Fantasy XIV content as well as a variety of other games. The link will be in the description down below. If you found this video helpful at all, or if you found anything that you think I may have missed, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Also, if you have any friends that are just getting into Final Fantasy XIV recently, or even if this could be their first MMO, I would really love if you would show them this video, as my aim is to help familiarize people with the common things they will see the most in the game, so they can have as enjoyable time as possible. Also be sure to stay tuned into the channel, as in the coming days we'll be releasing individual job guides to help new players better to understand the combat system and how their jobs play into party dynamics and the flow of the game as a whole. Once again, I am Ethermood, and until the next one, I will see you in Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers.